I decided to spend a week at the cabin because I needed quiet. I had been living in a noisy apartment for months, with people shouting in the hallway at night, dogs barking, car alarms going off randomly. I felt tired all the time. I wanted silence so badly that I didn't care how far the cabin was or how old it looked in the pictures. I wanted a place where my head could breathe. When I arrived, the sun was just starting to set behind the trees. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, with tall pines that looked like they had been growing there for 100 years. The place felt small compared to the size of those trees. The wooden boards were faded and soft-looking. The windows were narrow. The porch looked crooked, but it felt peaceful. The air was cold and clean. The only sound was wind brushing through the branches. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single bedroom, a bathroom with a small shower, a kitchen that smelled like old coffee, and a living room with a couch that felt too soft. The floor creaked every time I moved. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the wind humming through the small gaps between the boards. The place felt isolated in a way that made my chest loosen a bit. I thought I had made the right choice. The first night was calm. I made something quick to eat and sat on the couch, watching the last bit of daylight fade through the trees. I stayed awake for a bit, letting my mind settle, then went to bed early. The silence felt strange at first, but after a while it made me relax. I drifted into sleep easier than I had expected. It was the next morning when things started to feel off. I walked outside with a cup of coffee and stood at the edge of the yard, taking in the forest. The air felt colder than yesterday, but refreshing. When I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye. Something small. Something that didn't look like it belonged there. At the base of one of the trees near the tree line, there was a small black object pressed against the bark. It was round and flat, and for a second I thought it was just a rock wedged into the trunk. But when I stepped closer, the shape made sense. It was a camera lens. Tiny one. The kind used for motion-activated outdoor cameras. It was tucked neatly between the roots, angled just enough to face the cabin. I didn't touch it. I didn't even get too close. I just stared at it, trying to understand why it was there. I told myself the property owner probably put it there for security, maybe to watch for animals or protect guests from wildlife. It made sense, but something about the angle bothered me. It wasn't pointed at the woods. It wasn't facing a path or the driveway. It was facing the porch. The door. The window. It was pointed at me. I tried to shrug it off. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking. I went inside and tried to focus on anything else, but every time I sat still, my mind drifted back to the camera. After an hour, I finally forced myself to breathe and move on. People put cameras on properties all the time. It wasn't weird. At least that's what I told myself. By midday, I was back to feeling normal. I made lunch, walked around inside the cabin, and explored a bit of the yard. I kept telling myself this was supposed to be relaxing, and I didn't want paranoia to ruin it. But later that afternoon, I found something else. Behind the cabin, hidden by a row of bushes, there was another camera device. This one wasn't tucked into a tree. It was attached to a thin metal pole about waist height and pointed straight at the back window. I wouldn't have noticed it at all if the sunlight hadn't caught the edge of the lens. Now it felt wrong. 2 cameras wasn't an accident. 2 cameras pointed only at the cabin wasn't normal. I checked around the area, walking slowly. My heartbeat felt louder with each step. I didn't want to find anything else, but part of me knew I would. And I did. I found a 3rd camera near the side of the cabin, tied between 2 branches, aimed directly at the bedroom window. My stomach tightened. My hands felt cold even though the sun was still out. 3 cameras around one small cabin, all pointed inward. No sign of any on the driveway, the trees facing away, or anywhere else. Just around me. I went back inside and shut all the curtains. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to jump to some wild conclusion, but I also couldn't pretend it was normal anymore. Someone had placed those cameras there. Someone who wanted to see who stayed in the cabin. Someone who wanted to watch. I tried to focus on breathing again. I told myself I'd leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive the mountain road at night. I didn't want to make a mistake in the dark. But even as I tried to plan calmly, the fear in my chest kept growing. By the time it got dark, I felt tense in every part of my body. The cabin didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a cage I had walked into without knowing. I sat on the couch, trying to keep the lights dim so the windows didn't show silhouettes. My ears tuned into every noise outside. Every snap of a branch made me flinch. Every shift of wind made my shoulders tighten. Around midnight, I went to the bedroom to grab my bag so I could sleep closer to the front door. I didn't trust the back of the cabin anymore. I didn't trust any of the windows, and that was when I saw it. There was something taped to the outside of the bedroom window. On the glass, right in the center, there was a small square sticker that hadn't been there earlier. I wiped the foggy part of the glass with my sleeve and leaned closer. The sticker was shaped like a tiny circle, and I realized exactly what it was. A marker. Someone had marked the window with a tracking sticker, the kind used to line up lenses. It was placed dead center, like someone had used it to measure a perfect angle for a camera shot. That meant someone had been right outside that window at some point that day. Maybe while I was eating lunch. Maybe while I was walking behind the cabin. Maybe while I was inside trying to calm myself. The thought made my chest tighten so hard it hurt. My hands shook as I stepped back from the window. I moved into the living room, grabbed my bag, and sat on the floor with my back against the front door. My heart kept racing. I stared at the curtains, half expecting a shadow to appear behind them. I stayed awake the entire night, not even blinking for long. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something outside. A step, a breath, a rustle. The noises were soft, but they pushed deeper into my nerves each time. When the sky finally started to get lighter, I grabbed my keys and left the cabin without looking back. I tossed my bag into the car, turned the engine on, and drove away so fast the tires kicked up dirt. I didn't slow down until I reached the first intersection miles away. Only then did I check my phone. I had no signal the entire night. No way to call anyone if something had happened. No way to get help. The more I thought about it, the worse it got. Those cameras weren't placed by the property owner. No one trying to protect a rental cabin hides cameras in trees, behind bushes, and tied to branches. No one marks a bedroom window without telling guests. Someone else had put them there. Someone who knew people stayed alone in that cabin. Someone who watched through every window. Someone who stood close enough to place a tracking sticker right where I slept. And the worst part was the simple truth I couldn't avoid. Whoever had placed those cameras never planned to stop watching. Whoever had stood outside the bedroom window had done it once. They would have come back. Maybe that same night. Maybe the next. Maybe they came every night someone stayed there. And if I hadn't found those lenses, if I had stayed one more night, I think I would have woken up to the sound of someone opening the door. Not to break in, not to steal anything, but to finally meet the person they had spent so long watching. I went to the cabin because I needed to finish a large amount of work without any distractions. The cabin belonged to a friend who rarely used it, and he let me stay there for as long as I needed. It was deep in the woods, far from any towns, and I liked that. I wanted quiet. I wanted a simple place where I could sit, think, write, and clear my head for a few days. The drive there felt peaceful at first. The road got narrower the deeper I went, and the trees grew taller and thicker on both sides. Once I reached the cabin, the air felt still, almost too still. The cabin had one floor and an old wooden deck. The boards on the deck bent a little when I stepped on them. Inside, everything was simple. One bed, one small kitchen, a small bathroom, a desk, and a big window that faced the woods. I unpacked my bags and settled in fast because I wanted to start working right away. During the first night, nothing strange happened. I worked late, and when I finally lay down, the woods outside made the usual sounds I expected. Insects, the occasional rustling of leaves, and the soft creaking of old wood as the cabin cooled down. I fell asleep easily, and when I woke up the next morning, everything was normal. It was during the second night that strange things began to happen. I was working late again, and I had my laptop on the desk next to the window. The woods were dark, but the moonlight made some shapes visible. I wasn't paying much attention until I noticed something faint. A movement outside the window. It wasn't big, just a small shift of darkness. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. But the movement didn't match the way animals usually move. It felt slower, more steady, like someone walking and stopping. I tried to tell myself not to worry, but I kept glancing at the window. The glass made my reflection clear, so half the time I wasn't sure if I was seeing something outside or just catching the corner of my own face. After a while, I closed the curtains and kept working. I pushed the weird feeling aside. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up because I thought I heard something outside. Soft steps on leaves. The faint crunch far away. I stayed still in bed and listened hard, but the sounds never lasted long enough for me to be sure. When I woke up in the morning, I convinced myself it was only animals. During the third day, I walked around the cabin to get fresh air. When I went behind the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were clear footprints in the soft dirt. Not animal prints, human footprints. They were deep enough to be recent. I followed them a little with my eyes, and they led straight toward the window where my desk sat inside. It looked like someone had been standing there, watching through that window while I worked. I tried to calm myself down. Could have been hikers passing by. Could have been the cabin owner from days earlier. The dirt might have been soft enough to preserve prints for longer. I made myself stop thinking about it and went back inside, though I felt uneasy the rest of the day. That evening, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked before it got dark. I sat at the desk again to work, but I couldn't focus. I kept checking the window even though the curtains were closed. At some point, I stopped working and just sat there listening. The silence felt too heavy, like something was pressing down on the cabin. Around midnight, while I lay in bed, I heard something that I couldn't explain away this time. It came from the deck outside. Slow, heavy steps, one at a time. The old wood creaked loudly each time something pressed down on it. My whole body went rigid. I stayed perfectly still and held my breath. The steps moved across the deck and stopped near the front door. I waited for a knock or for the door handle to move. Nothing happened. Whoever or whatever was standing out there wasn't trying to get inside. It was just standing still. Then, after what felt like minutes, the steps moved again and faded into the distance. I barely slept at all after that. Every small sound made me jump. The next morning, I opened the front door slowly and checked the deck. There was dirt on the boards, like someone with muddy shoes had walked across it. The prints were too big to be from a kid. They weren't the same size as mine either. They were slightly wider and longer. I started to think about leaving the cabin, but I had come all the way out here to finish my work. I told myself I could handle a few strange noises. I didn't want to run away over something that might have been just a hunter or someone passing by at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was knew I was inside. That night was the worst. I didn't even try to work. I just sat on the edge of the bed, listening. I kept the lights off, thinking it would make me less noticeable. For a long time, the woods outside were quiet. Then, without warning, I heard a branch snap close to the cabin. Not a small snap. A deep, heavy break that suggested someone stepped on it. I felt a cold wave rush over me. I sat still, breathing shallow. More sounds came from the woods. Slow, steady footsteps approaching the cabin from behind. They moved with purpose, not like an animal wandering around. They came closer and closer until I could hear them near the back wall. Then I heard breathing. It was faint but real. A steady, slow exhale. Someone was standing right behind the cabin wall, breathing quietly like they were trying not to make noise. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Then the footsteps moved again, this time toward the window by the desk. I stared at the curtains even though I could not see anything through them. The person stood right in front of that window. I could feel it. There was a long period of silence. Then I heard a soft brushing sound. Someone's hands sliding along the outside of the wall, dragging slowly across the wood. The person stayed there for a long time, far longer than any animal would. I felt a sick fear growing in my stomach. I thought they might try the door again or come to the bedroom window or break something. But eventually the steps faded into the woods. I didn't move a single muscle until the sky started to lighten. As soon as the sun rose enough for me to see outside, I grabbed my bag and packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't bother folding anything. I didn't even eat. I just threw my belongings into the car, locked the cabin behind me out of habit, and started driving away. When I drove past the edge of the woods, I finally allowed myself to breathe normally again. I didn't know who that person was. I didn't know if they lived out there, or if they had been watching the cabin for days, or if they just enjoyed scaring people. The cabin didn't have cameras, and there was no phone signal, so I had nothing to explain what happened. The only thing I knew for sure was that someone was out there every night, watching and coming closer each time. The final thing that made everything feel real happened when I got home and unpacked. At the bottom of my bag, tucked between some clothes, I found something I didn't put there. A small piece of folded paper. It looked dirty, like it had fallen on the forest floor. When I opened it, there was nothing written inside. Just a blank, dirty piece of paper. That meant only one thing. Someone had been inside the cabin while I slept on one of those nights. That was enough for me to know I would never go back to that cabin again. I rented the cabin because I wanted to finish a project I had been avoiding for months. I kept telling myself that if I could get away from everything, noise, work, people, distractions, I could finally focus. I picked a cabin that was deep in the woods, far from the main road, because I thought total isolation would help. I didn't think about what that kind of isolation really meant. I didn't think about how it would feel when the sun went down and I was sitting alone in a small wooden box surrounded by darkness and miles of trees. The cabin was older than I expected. The wooden boards were dry and cracked. The porch sank slightly in one corner. The door made a low groaning sound every time it opened. There were two small rooms. A living room with a fireplace and a tiny bedroom with a single bed. The windows were narrow and looked like they belonged in a shed, not a place people slept in. But the quiet felt nice at first. It felt like the world had finally stopped spinning around me. The first day went smoothly. I unpacked, got some writing done, walked along the edge of the forest, and listened to the wind. There were no neighbors, no cars, no voices. Just the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of the cabin. It almost felt peaceful. Almost. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel wrong. I was sitting at the small table trying to write when I heard something outside. A slow crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. At first, I told myself it had to be an animal. There were plenty of deer around here, maybe even a fox or two. But the steps didn't sound light. They sounded steady, slow, deliberate, almost like someone walking. I sat perfectly still, listening. The steps stopped. The woods became silent again. I told myself it didn't matter. It was probably nothing. I tried to keep writing, but my hands tightened around the pen. I felt my heartbeat pick up, and every few seconds, I looked toward the window even though I couldn't see anything outside. Later that night, when I finally tried to sleep, I kept thinking about those steps. The silence felt heavier now, like it was hiding something. I lay awake for what felt like hours before I finally drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw something strange near the porch. The dirt there had footprints. Not clear ones, but enough to tell they weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, spaced with a longer stride. Someone had walked right up to the cabin sometime during the night. I stood there staring at them for a long time. My skin felt tight and cold. My first thought was that it must have been some hiker who got lost. But the footprints didn't look confused or wandering. They were in a straight line to the porch, then a straight line back into the woods. Someone came to the cabin, stopped, then left. I tried to calm myself by thinking maybe the property owner came by to check something. Maybe they inspected cabins sometimes. I forced myself to let it go, because I didn't want fear to ruin the rest of the week. I had come here to work. I couldn't just pack up because of footprints. But that night, the steps came back. I heard them while I was lying in bed. Soft, slow crunching, moving toward the cabin from somewhere deep in the woods. My whole body went cold. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps got closer, and I could hear the faint rustle of bushes being pushed aside. When the steps finally stopped, it sounded like they were right next to the front porch. Then everything went silent. I didn't look out the window. I didn't get up. I stayed in the bed with my eyes wide open and tried to listen for anything else. But the footsteps didn't come back. Whoever or whatever it was didn't walk away this time. They just stopped. Then silence. I barely slept at all. In the morning, when the sun finally came up, I stepped outside again. This time, the footprints were clearer, fresh, deep, and they led not just to the porch but around the entire cabin. Someone had walked the full perimeter. Slow circles around the walls. It made my stomach twist, because walking around a building in the dark wasn't something someone did accidentally. It wasn't something someone did for no reason. Someone had been studying the cabin. Someone had been checking every wall, every window. I went back inside and locked the door even though the lock felt weak and thin. I sat on the couch with my hands shaking and tried to figure out what to do. It was still early. I could leave. I could drive back and forget the whole thing. But part of me didn't want to feel like I was running away from something I couldn't explain. I tried to talk myself out of the panic building inside me. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing just feet away from where I slept. Someone had been outside those thin walls listening to me move around inside. I kept telling myself I would stay just one more night. I wanted to believe the footprints didn't mean anything. I wanted to convince myself it was some hunter or someone who didn't realize a person was staying in the cabin. But that third night changed everything. It was almost midnight when I heard the first sound. A faint scraping noise near the kitchen window, like fingers brushing lightly across the glass. My whole body stiffened. I lay completely still on the bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark. A few seconds later, the scraping returned. This time longer, slower. It sounded like someone dragging something across the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened, feeling my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. Then I heard breathing. Outside the window. Slow, heavy breathing. The kind someone makes when they're standing still. It was so close I could almost feel it. The glass was thin, and the night air carried sound easily. Whoever was out there wasn't moving away this time. They were standing there, listening. Waiting. I lay frozen in the dark, unable to think clearly. Every part of my body felt trapped. I kept waiting for the door to shake, for the window to break, for something loud, but nothing happened. After a long time, the breathing stopped. I didn't hear footsteps leaving. I didn't hear anything else after that. I waited until sunrise before I moved. When I finally gathered the courage to step outside, I went to the kitchen window. On the glass, smeared across the lower corner, were streaks of dirt. Long smudges, like someone pressed their fingers against it. Someone tall enough to reach that height. Someone who wasn't afraid to stand right at the window and peer inside. That was it. I shoved my things into my bag and didn't even try to organize anything. I grabbed the keys, opened the door, and nearly ran to the car. I didn't look at the trees. I didn't look at the porch. I didn't look for more footprints because I already knew I'd see them. I knew someone had come back. Someone who had been watching the cabin night after night. Someone who circled the walls. Someone who stood right outside the windows. Someone who breathed against the glass while I tried to sleep. I drove down the long dirt road as fast as I safely could. My hands didn't stop shaking until I reached the main highway. Only then did I feel like I had put real distance between me and whatever and whoever had been in those woods. When I finally returned home, I called the owner and told them I was leaving early. They didn't seem surprised. They didn't ask for details. They didn't offer explanations. They just said they would look into it. I didn't tell them anything about the footprints or the breathing or the window. I didn't want to hear any excuse they would come up with. I just wanted to be away from that place. The worst part wasn't the footsteps or the breathing. The worst part was realizing how long it must have been going on before I noticed anything at all. The first night, I heard steps. The second, I found footprints. The third, someone was already comfortable enough to stand at the window and leave fingerprints on the glass. They didn't just arrive that night. They had been watching long before I heard them. Maybe they watched people who stayed there every time. Maybe they waited until someone was alone. Maybe they studied the routine of every guest, figuring out which cabins were easy, which windows were quiet, which nights were darkest. Because the way they moved didn't feel random, felt patient, felt practiced. And the thing that sits with me the most, the thing that still makes me check windows before bed, is knowing that whoever stood outside that cabin wasn't trying to scare me. They were waiting for something, maybe for the lights to go off, maybe for the door to open, maybe for a moment when I wasn't paying attention. I left before they got that moment, but someone else might not. I booked the cabin because I wanted a break from everything. My phone wouldn't stop ringing back home, and I felt like I couldn't breathe around people anymore. I wanted silence. I wanted space. I wanted to sit somewhere where nothing demanded anything from me. So I drove out to a small cabin near the mountains, far from the main road and far from anyone who might bother me. The cabin looked simple from the outside. Old wood, wide porch, small windows, and a roof covered with pine needles that looked like they had been there for years. The area around it was thick with trees. The sun didn't even hit half of the yard because the branches blocked it. It felt cold the moment I stepped out of the car, even though it wasn't winter. The air had that sharp, almost metallic smell that made me think of wet soil and old moss. Inside, the cabin felt cleaner than I expected. A small living room, tiny kitchen, a single bedroom. The walls were made of wooden boards that had darkened with age, and the floor creaked even under light steps. It felt like a place that had been used for years but never updated. A place people stayed in for a night or two, then left without thinking about it again. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in, but the silence made it hard. There were no birds, no wind, just an empty quiet that seemed to press against my ears. I kept telling myself this was what I wanted, but it felt different when I stood in the middle of it. The first strange thing I noticed happened that evening. I was sitting on the bed, scrolling through random things on my phone even though the signal kept dropping. I heard a faint sound behind the wall. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft, quick scratching, like something tiny brushing against wood. I figured it was a mouse or something small. Cabins like this always had animals in the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it didn't stop. It would go quiet for a few seconds, then start again. More scratching, sometimes slower, sometimes faster. Every time I tried to relax, the sound dragged my attention back to it. It wasn't coming from one spot either. It seemed to move, like it traveled along inside the walls, across the room, above my head, near the floor, then somewhere behind me again. I kept telling myself it was normal. Animals lived in old cabins. It wasn't something I needed to fear, but the sound stayed with me the whole night. I barely slept. The next morning, I felt tired and irritable, but I tried to shake it off. I made coffee and stood outside for a while, trying to breathe through the heaviness that had settled in my chest. The trees around the cabin stood close and tall. They blocked most of the sky. I thought I would find peace in that kind of isolation, but instead it felt like the world outside the cabin was pushing in on me. Too tight, too close. When I went back inside, I heard the scratching again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. It didn't sound like tiny claws anymore. It sounded heavier, slower, like something dragging across wood. I went to the wall where the sound came from, staring at the boards, trying to understand it. The scratching stopped right when I got close. That made it worse, somehow. The rest of the day felt off. The air inside the cabin seemed stale, like it hadn't moved in years. Every step I took echoed slightly. I couldn't focus on anything long enough to feel calm. And every hour or so, I heard the scratching again. Short bursts of it. Sometimes loud enough that I jumped. Sometimes faint, like something moving far inside the wall. By sunset, I started to feel watched. There were no windows on the back wall of the cabin. Only the living room window facing the yard and the kitchen window that showed a sliver of the forest. The more the scratching continued, the more I kept glancing at those windows, half expecting someone to be standing outside. But every time I looked, the yard was empty. The scratching picked up again once it got dark. It was louder than before. It moved faster along the boards, like something restless. I sat on the couch and tried to focus on my breathing, but I couldn't keep my eyes away from the walls. I kept imagining something breaking through the wood, even though I knew that made no sense. I ended up staying awake most of the night again, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the noises to stop. They didn't. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I didn't even care about the rest of the days I had paid for. I just wanted out of that cabin. I wanted a normal house with normal sounds again. But before I left, I needed to pack everything. When I grabbed my bag and walked toward the bedroom, I froze in the doorway. There were scratches on the wall. Not little marks, not tiny claw lines. Deep, long grooves in the wood, like they were carved with something sharp. They ran from the floor to almost the ceiling, cutting through the surface of the boards. The wood around them looked fresh, like it had been ripped recently. Tiny splinters were scattered on the floor beneath them. I stared at them for a long time. I tried to make sense of how they got there. I hadn't heard anything that violent during the night, and the marks didn't look like an animal made them. They looked too clean, too straight, like they were made by a hand holding something sharp. My stomach twisted. My skin felt tight. I backed out of the room slowly, keeping my eyes on the scratches. The idea that someone had been inside the cabin while I slept hit me like a punch. I grabbed my keys and my bag and moved toward the front door, but before I reached it, I heard something behind the wall again. This time it wasn't scratching. It was breathing. Slow, heavy breathing from inside the wall, low and steady, like someone pressing their face against the other side of the wood. My whole body locked up. I stood there listening, barely able to swallow. I waited for it to stop, but it didn't. The breathing stayed steady, calm, a real human rhythm. I knew what it meant, even though I didn't want to believe it. Someone was inside the walls. Someone had been there the whole time. I didn't stay another second. I didn't think. I didn't double-check anything. I bolted out the front door, ran to my car, and drove faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't wait to look back. I didn't want to see if anyone came out of the cabin. I drove all the way to town before I stopped. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit parked for 5 minutes before I could catch my breath. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror, my face looked pale and exhausted. My eyes looked hollow. I felt like my body had been running on fear for days. When I told the property owner later that day that I was leaving early, he didn't argue. He didn't even ask why. He just said he would check the cabin later. I didn't tell him about the scratches. I didn't tell him about the breathing, because I didn't want to think about who or what had been living in the walls. I didn't want to picture how long that person had been crawling through the inside of that cabin, waiting, listening. The worst part wasn't the scratches or the breathing. The worst part was knowing that the cabin had been silent the first day I arrived. Completely silent, which meant whoever was inside the walls didn't start scratching until after I got there. They stayed quiet at first. They watched me settle in. And then, once they knew I was alone, they started moving. I booked the cabin because I wanted to get away from everything for a few days. Work had been a mess, and my sleep had been worse. I thought a quiet place would fix my head a little. The pictures online made it look peaceful. A single-story wooden cabin sitting near a frozen lake, surrounded by tall pine trees and open space. No neighbors, no traffic, just silence. At the time, that sounded perfect. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon. The air felt colder than I expected, the kind of cold that sinks into your jacket and stays there. The sky was pale and heavy, like it would snow later. The cabin looked older than the pictures, with a few boards that seemed warped from past winters. The front steps creaked under my weight. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and dust. Everything felt still, like no one had opened the door in months. There was one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom that looked recently remodeled, and a living room with a big window that faced the lake. That window felt like the best part of the place. When I stood in front of it, I could see the entire stretch of water, frozen and white, and the tree line on the other side. Felt empty, but not in a bad way. More like a blank page. I spent the evening unpacking and trying to settle in. The silence was so deep it almost felt physical. No cars, no dogs, not even birds. just the faint sound of wind pushing through the trees. I tried to tell myself it was peaceful, but it actually made me a little uneasy. I wasn't used to hearing nothing. By nighttime, the sky turned black and the temperature dropped fast. I kept the heater running and made something simple to eat. I wanted to watch a show on my phone before sleeping, but the signal barely worked. It loaded for a minute, then froze. I eventually gave up and decided to walk around inside instead, trying to tire myself out. That was when I first noticed the footprints. I went to the big window in the living room, just looking outside because I had nothing else to do. The moonlight lit the snow enough to see the yard clearly. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at, but the longer I stared, the more it made sense. There were tracks leading from the tree line on the right side of the yard. They were long, deep footprints in the snow, spaced out just enough to show someone had walked slowly and with purpose. They came from the trees and stopped right beneath the window I was standing in front of. My chest tightened. The prints weren't mine. I had walked from my car straight to the steps earlier. These came from the opposite direction, far from where I had been. Someone had stood outside that window recently, maybe earlier that day, maybe while I was inside. The snow looked smooth and clean around the prints, which told me they were fresh. No signs of melting or older marks underneath. The wind hadn't even filled them in yet. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring down at them. I wanted to believe it was nothing, maybe a hiker or someone who got lost. But nobody should have been out there. The cabin was miles from the main road. I closed the curtains and tried to shake the feeling off. I checked the doors twice to make sure they were locked. I tried to distract myself, but my thoughts kept going back to those prints. I went to bed late, but I barely slept. Every small sound seemed louder than it should be. The heater clicking on, the wood settling, the branches scraping against each other outside. My brain turned every noise into something dangerous. I finally dozed off sometime around morning. When I woke up, the light coming through the curtains felt thin and cold. I got up and went straight to the window again, part of me hoping the prints were gone. But they weren't. They were still there. And now there were more. A second set of footprints circled around the cabin. They went along the side of the house, past the bedroom window, around the back, and disappeared near the trees behind the cabin. Whoever it was had walked the entire perimeter while I was sleeping. The idea of someone walking around the cabin while I lay inside made my stomach twist. I kept looking at the prints like I needed to prove to myself they were real. They were spaced out and deep, made by someone with long strides, someone bigger than me, someone who wasn't scared to walk that close. I felt a pressure inside my chest, a slow panic building. I tried to calm myself by making breakfast, but my hands wouldn't stay steady. The windows felt too thin. The walls felt too weak. The silence felt heavier than before, like it was waiting for something. By noon, I decided I would leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive on icy roads in the dark, and I didn't want to panic myself into making a mistake. I spent the afternoon trying to stay busy, but the whole time I felt watched. Every time I passed a window, I checked it. Every time the wind moved something outside, I flinched. When night came again, it felt worse than the night before. The darkness outside the windows looked thicker, like it was pressing against the cabin. The footprints were still visible, and I kept picturing someone walking slowly around the cabin again while I was inside. I stayed in the living room, sitting on the couch with the lights on. I didn't even try to sleep. I just listened. I kept waiting for some sound that would tell me someone was out there. And eventually it came. It was soft at first, a faint crunching sound, snow being stepped on. At first I thought I imagined it, but it happened again. Slow, heavy steps coming from the right side of the cabin. My heartbeat picked up fast, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move at first. My body felt frozen. The steps kept going, one after another, getting closer. They weren't rushed. They weren't panicked. They were careful and slow, like the person didn't care if they were heard. The steps reached the corner of the cabin and stopped. I sat there staring at the front door, waiting for it to open even though I knew it was locked. The silence that followed felt so sharp it almost hurt. I slowly got up and moved toward the window, even though every part of me didn't want to. I pulled the curtain just enough to see outside. A man was standing in the yard. He was facing the cabin, standing perfectly still. His clothes looked dark and heavy, and his shoulders were broad. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew he was looking directly at the window, directly at me, like he had known I would check. My body locked up. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just stared at him because I didn't know what else to do. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there watching the cabin, watching me. After a few minutes, he slowly turned and walked toward the back of the cabin, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't hear the steps afterward. I didn't hear anything. I stayed awake the whole night, sitting against the wall with every light on. I didn't go near the windows again. When the sun finally started rising, I grabbed my things and packed everything in a rush. I didn't even fold anything. I threw it all into my bag and forced myself to step outside. The cold air hit me hard, but the fear hit even harder. The footprints were everywhere, so many more than before. They circled the cabin again and again. Some were right outside the bedroom window. Some were only inches from the front door. And the ones from last night, those were fresh, clean, sharp at the edges. I kept my head down and walked fast to the car. When I turned on the engine, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. As I drove away, I kept checking the mirrors. I half expected to see someone running from the trees, but I saw nothing, just snow and shadows. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main highway. I didn't stop until buildings and people were around me again. Later, when I thought about everything, the part that stayed with me wasn't the man standing outside. It wasn't the footprints. It wasn't the steps in the snow. It was the fact that he never tried to force his way inside. He didn't break in. He didn't test the windows. He didn't try the door. He didn't want anything from me at all. He only wanted to watch. And the scariest part was realizing he had probably been watching long before I ever noticed the first footprint. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will, because I don't think that man was passing through. I think he lived out there, and I think he knew the cabin wasn't supposed to have anyone in it. And I think the only reason he never came inside was because he didn't want to rush whatever he had planned.